The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly under a gray November sky, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. In a remote valley where cell phone signals feared to tread, stood a weathered cabin that had seen better decades. This was home to Ethan Cole, a 28-year-old man whose calloused hands told stories of survival that his quiet voice never would. Ethan had inherited the cabin from his grandfather 3 years ago, along with 12 acres of stubborn land and a legacy of mountain resilience. He worked odd jobs in the nearest town, 40 minutes down a winding dirt road. Construction sites, timber yards, whatever paid enough to keep the propane tank filled and the pantry stocked through winter. The pay was meager, the work brutal, but Ethan never complained. Complaining was a luxury for people who had other options. The cabin itself was a patchwork of repairs. The roof leaked in the northeast corner during heavy rains. The windows rattled when the wind picked up. The wood-burning stove, a cast-iron beast from the 1950s, was the heart of the home. It heated the entire space, cooked his meals, and on the coldest nights, meant the difference between sleep and hypothermia. On this particular morning, Ethan woke to frost on the inside of the windows. His breath formed clouds as he swung his legs out of bed, his feet meeting the icy floor. He pulled on 2 pairs of socks, his work boots, a thermal shirt, a flannel, and his grandfather's old hunting jacket. The thermometer outside read 19 degrees. He approached the stove with the morning ritual he'd performed 1,000 times. Open the door, check for embers, at kindling, blow gently, watch the flames catch. But this morning something was different. The fire had died completely during the night. Not even a single glowing ember remained. Ethan frowned. He reached for his box of matches. Empty. He checked the drawer where he kept backup supplies. Nothing. His lighter had run out of fluid 2 days ago, and he'd forgotten to buy a new one in town. A knot of worry tightened in his stomach. No matches. No lighter. No fire. He stood there for a moment, staring at the cold stove. Without fire, the cabin would become uninhabitable within hours. The temperature was dropping. A storm was forecasted for tonight. He had food that needed cooking, water that would freeze in the pipes, and a body that couldn't withstand prolonged exposure to this cold. Ethan grabbed his truck keys and headed outside. The Ford pickup was older than he was, paint faded and rust blooming on the wheel wells. He turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. He tried again. Same result. The cold had drained what little life the battery had left. He sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it tightly. No truck meant no trip to town. No trip to town meant no matches. The nearest neighbor was old Mrs. Patterson, but she lived 6 miles away, and the trek through snow-covered terrain would take hours. Ethan returned to the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities. He'd read somewhere that people used to start fires with friction, rubbing sticks together. He spent the next hour trying, his hands cramping, his frustration mounting. Nothing. Not even smoke. He tried the magnifying glass method, angling it toward the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. The sun was too dim, the angle too poor. By noon, his fingers were numb, and panic was beginning to set in. That's when he remembered something his grandfather once told him. Years ago, when Ethan was just a boy visiting during summers, the old man had shown him a drawer in the workbench. Inside were odds and ends collected over decades. Random screws, old coins, bits of string. And among them, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth, was a small fragment of charcoal. Not regular charcoal. This was from a lightning-struck oak that had stood near the property line. His grandfather had gathered pieces after the strike, claiming lightning burned would held special properties. He'd kept one piece no bigger than a domino, as a sort of talisman. Ethan had laughed back then, dismissing it as old mountain superstition. But now, desperate and cold, he went to that workbench. His fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled with the drawer. There, beneath layers of dust and time, was the cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully. The charcoal was exactly as he remembered. Black, porous, surprisingly light. Worth maybe 6 cents if you sold it by weight. Worthless by any practical measure. Yet as Ethan held it in his palm, studying its rough surface, an idea began to form. His grandfather hadn't been entirely superstitious. He'd been practical in ways that modern convenience had erased. Ethan knew that charcoal could hold an ember far longer than wood. If he could somehow coax even the smallest spark from somewhere, this piece of charcoal might be able to nurse it into flame. But first, he needed that spark. The afternoon light was fading fast, and with it, any hope of warmth. Ethan's breath came in short, visible puffs as he ransacked every corner of the cabin, searching for anything that could create a spark. His movements became increasingly frantic. He found an old battery in a junk drawer, corroded and likely dead, but he tried anyway. Using 2 wires, he attempted to create a spark by touching the terminals. Nothing happened. The battery was completely drained. The temperature inside had dropped to 38 degrees. Ethan could no longer feel his toes inside his boots. His hands shook as he searched. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell anymore. The storm clouds were gathering faster than forecasted, turning the sky a menacing shade of steel. He tried everything. He struck rocks together for an hour until his palms bled. He attempted to create friction with a shoelace wrapped around a stick. He even considered breaking apart the truck battery, but knew the sulfuric acid inside would likely kill him before the cold did. By 4 in the afternoon, Ethan sat on the floor in front of the dead stove, the piece of charcoal still clutched in his hand. His body was beginning to show signs of hypothermia. His thinking had slowed. His speech, when he talked to himself, came out slurred. The shivering that had racked his body earlier had stopped, which he knew was a very bad sign. He thought about his grandfather, about all the stories of mountain survival he'd heard growing up. There had to be something he was missing. Some old technique, some forgotten method. His mind felt foggy, thoughts sliding away before he could fully grasp them. Then he remembered. Steel wool and a battery. Not a regular battery, but... His eyes fell on his old cell phone charging in the corner. The phone was dead, service non-existent up here, but he'd kept it plugged in out of habit. The battery inside might still hold some charge. With trembling fingers, Ethan found a screwdriver and pried open the phone's back panel. The lithium battery looked intact. He'd need steel wool, though, and he had none. But wait. His grandmother's old cleaning supplies were still under the sink. He crawled over, his movements slow and clumsy. There, behind bottles of dried-up soap and rusted cans, was a pad of steel wool she'd used for scrubbing pots. It was old, rusty in places, but it might work. Ethan positioned the steel wool in the stove, placed the precious charcoal fragment on top, and with hands that barely cooperated, touched the battery terminals to the steel wool. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a tiny orange glow appeared in the steel wool. It grew brighter, spreading through the fine metal threads. Smoke began to rise. The charcoal fragment sat above it, waiting, as Ethan held his breath and prayed to every god his grandfather had ever mentioned. The orange glow in the steel wool intensified, spreading like a tiny constellation of fire. Ethan leaned closer, careful not to breathe too hard and extinguish the fragile ember. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the charcoal fragment begin to respond to the heat beneath it. Smoke curled upward, thin wisps at first, then thicker. The charcoal's edges started to glow, a deep red that pulsed with life. Ethan's grandfather had been right. Lightning struck would held something different, some quality that made it catch faster, burn hotter, respond to the smallest invitation of heat. He reached for the kindling he'd prepared hours ago, his movements deliberate despite the urgency screaming through his veins. Too fast and he'd smother it. Too slow and the ember would die. He placed the smallest twigs around the glowing charcoal, creating a teepee structure his grandfather had taught him decades ago. The first twig began to smoke. Then another. The charcoal glowed brighter now, its 6-cent worth proving more valuable than gold in this moment. A small flame licked up the side of a twig, hesitant at first, then growing bolder. Ethan added another piece of kindling. The flame reached for it hungrily. Within minutes, he had a small but genuine fire crackling in the stove. He closed the door partially, adjusting the airflow just right, and watched through the glass as the flames grew stronger. Heat began to radiate from the cast iron. Ethan stayed on the floor, holding his hands toward the warmth, feeling sensation return to his fingers in painful tingles. Tears streamed down his face, though he couldn't say if they were from relief, exhaustion, or the residual fear of how close he'd come to freezing in his own home. If you're sitting there right now, rooting for Ethan and that little piece of charcoal that refused to give up, take a second and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next is going to show you why some things that seem worthless turn out to be the most valuable of all. This story is just getting started. As feeling returned to his body, Ethan added larger pieces of wood to the fire. The stove began to roar with life, its familiar sound filling the cabin like a heartbeat restored. He put a pot of water on top to boil, knowing he needed something hot inside him. Outside, the first snowflakes of the storm began to fall, fat and heavy, the kind that would pile up fast and make the mountain roads impassable for days. Ethan watched through the window as the world turned white, grateful beyond words that he was on this side of the glass with fire warming his bones. He looked at the remaining fragment of charcoal, now partially consumed but still intact. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Keep what matters, even if others call it worthless. You never know when worthless becomes priceless. The storm raged for 3 days. Snow piled for feet high against the cabin walls, transforming the landscape into an impenetrable white fortress. Ethan was completely isolated, but now he was prepared. The fire never went out again. He tended it constantly, adding wood through the night, keeping the flames alive with a vigilance born from nearly losing everything. During those long hours trapped inside, something shifted in Ethan. He began to see his life differently. For 3 years he'd been surviving, just barely keeping his head above water, working jobs that paid little and led nowhere. He told himself he was honoring his grandfather's memory by staying on the land, but the truth was simpler and sadder. He'd been hiding from a world that had hurt him. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 19. His fiancée had left him 2 years later, unable to handle his grief and isolation. He'd retreated to these mountains because here, alone, no one could abandon him. No one could leave. But that piece of charcoal had taught him something profound. His grandfather hadn't kept it because of superstition. He'd kept it because he understood that survival meant holding on to resources others dismissed. It meant seeing value where others saw trash. It meant being ready for the moment when everything depended on something small. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunlight flooded across pristine snow, so bright it hurt to look at. Ethan bundled up and made his way to the truck. With the battery now warmed from sitting near the stove overnight, the engine turned over on the second try. He drove to town, the roads barely passable, taking nearly 2 hours to cover what normally took 40 minutes. At the hardware store, he bought matches, lighters, emergency supplies he should have had months ago. But he also bought something else: books on sustainable living, solar panels, backup generators. He was done just surviving. At the town diner, he ran into Marcus Webb, owner of Webb Construction. Marcus had given Ethan occasional work over the years, always paid fair, never asked too many questions about why a capable young man was wasting away on a mountain. Marcus looked up from his coffee as Ethan approached. Something must have shown in Ethan's face, some new determination, because Marcus smiled before Ethan even spoke. "I want to learn everything," Ethan said. "Not just labor. I want to know how to build, how to wire, how to make things that last." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Be at the site Monday morning, 6 sharp. I'll teach you everything your grandfather would have wanted you to know." Ethan shook his hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that burned as steady as the fire now crackling in his cabin stove. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted, revealing the mountain in shades of green Ethan had forgotten existed. He'd spent the winter learning under Marcus's patient instruction, absorbing skills with the hunger of someone who'd finally found purpose. Carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, masonry. His hands, already tough from labor, became precise instruments of creation. Marcus paid him fairly and taught him something more valuable than any wage: how to see potential in broken things. They renovated old homes together, transforming spaces people had abandoned into places worth living in again. Ethan discovered he had an eye for it, a natural understanding of how to take something damaged and make it whole. By April, Ethan had saved enough to begin his own project. The cabin that had nearly become his tomb would become his testament. He started with the roof, replacing every rotted board and shingle. Then the windows, installing new double-pane glass that actually kept the cold out. He rewired the electrical system, added solar panels on the south-facing slope, and installed a backup generator in a small shed he built himself. But he kept the wood-burning stove. He restored it, cleaned it until the cast iron shone, replaced the door gasket, and made sure it would burn efficiently for another 70 years. And in a place of honor on the mantel above it, he mounted the remaining fragment of charcoal in a small glass case his own hands had crafted. Word spread in town about Ethan's transformation. People who'd seen him as just another lost soul struggling in the mountains now saw someone different. Someone capable. Someone who'd turned his life around. Job offers came. Small at first, then larger. A deck here, a bathroom renovation there, then entire home additions. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor 6 miles away, hired him to make her home safer before the next winter. While working there, he met her granddaughter, Sarah, a nurse who'd moved back to care for her grandmother. Sarah had kind eyes and a laugh that reminded Ethan what joy sounded like. They started slow. Coffee after he finished work. Dinner in town on Saturdays. Walks through the mountain trails as wildflowers bloomed. Sarah didn't try to fix him or change him. She simply saw him, really saw him, and liked what she found. By summer, Ethan had hired 2 apprentices of his own. Young men from town who needed what Marcus had given him. A chance and knowledge. He taught them the same way Marcus taught him, with patience and the understanding that skills were just the surface. What they really needed to learn was how to see value in themselves. The cabin now stood solid and warm, a home rather than a shelter. Solar panels gleamed on the roof. The garden Ethan planted flourished. And inside, the stove burned steadily, fed by the same hands that had once trembled with cold and fear. He'd kept what mattered, and in keeping it he'd found everything else. 2 years later, the cabin had become something his grandfather would have marveled at. The property now included a workshop where Ethan ran his construction business, a greenhouse where Sarah grew vegetables year-round, and a smaller guest cabin they'd built together for visitors. The main cabin glowed with warmth on this December evening. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner while Sarah decorated a Christmas tree in the corner. Her grandmother had passed peacefully in her sleep 6 months ago, and Sarah had moved in permanently, bringing with her laughter, music, and a sense of home Ethan hadn't known he was missing. On the mantel, the charcoal fragment remained in its glass case, a conversation piece that never got old. Every person who visited asked about it, and Ethan never tired of telling the story. Not the dramatic version where he nearly froze to death, but the truth underneath. How something worthless had taught him to see value everywhere. His business had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. Coal Mountain Construction was known throughout 3 counties for quality work and fair prices. His 2 apprentices had become partners, and together they'd hired 4 more young people eager to learn. They specialized in restoration work, taking abandoned properties and bringing them back to life. Marcus Webb had retired last spring, handing Ethan the keys to his old workshop with tears in his eyes and pride in his voice. "You did what your grandfather hoped you'd do," Marcus had said. "You became the man you were always meant to be." Ethan's truck, the same Ford that had failed him that frozen November morning, still ran. He'd rebuilt the engine himself, replaced the battery, painted it a deep blue. Some things you fix, some things you keep, some things you let go. Knowing the difference was wisdom his grandfather had tried to teach him, but that he'd only learned through fire. Sarah walked over and wrapped her arms around him from behind. The stove crackled softly, its eternal presence a reminder of the night that changed everything. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, beautiful rather than threatening. Ethan thought about that moment when he'd held a 6-cent piece of charcoal in his frozen hands, desperate and afraid. He'd believed he was fighting for fire, but really he'd been fighting for himself, for the courage to live rather than just survive, for the strength to build something worth keeping. The charcoal had saved him, but more than that, it had shown him that salvation often comes in the smallest, most overlooked forms. You just have to be willing to see it. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that even the smallest spark can reignite your whole life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me what small thing changed everything for you. And if you have suggestions for the next story, I'd love to hear them. Thank you for watching until the end. Stay warm out there, and remember, never underestimate what seems worthless. Sometimes that's where the real value hides.